So we are now near to the end of our conference today, and it's nearly time for the inaugural Stephen and Jane Poss Churchill Lecture, given by our keynote speaker, Andrew Roberts. But before that, I'd like to remind you that on the conference website, we have our online auction. It's still open and will remain so until midnight, where you can place bids on a number of remarkable and unique Churchill items, including a bespoke Conway Stewart pen, which was a favoured brand of Churchill's, and you can also place bids on a wonderfully bound copy of the new edition of The River War by Jim Muller. Or by this time tomorrow, you could be the proud owner of a bronze cast of Churchill's hand, taken from life by the celebrated sculptor Oscar Neman. All the money raised from the auction will go to support the charitable work of the International Churchill Society. Thanks to all of you who've placed bids so far, but remember, the clock is ticking and you have until midnight tonight until the auction closes. We have now reached the final session of the conference, and our intention is to leave you on a high. Thanks to the wonderful generosity of Stephen and Jane Poss, we will now have an annual Churchill lecture highlighting the best of the recent scholarship. I'm delighted that Stephen and Jane are with us in the room today, and that Stephen will come onto the stage to welcome our speaker. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Catherine. All I can say is wow, we've just heard the definition of courage. Good evening. Jane and I are delighted and honored to be here among the Churchill family and so many loyal and distinguished Churchillians. And this is truly a joint project, joint commitment. If my wife Jane could just stand up and so you can see her there. I have two briefs, as they say over here. One is to say a few words about the background of this lecture series and how it came to pass, because I think it demonstrates that anyone can become involved with the International Churchill Society. You don't need to have been with them for years. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to know anybody. You can just pick up the phone, because that's what we did. Jane and I love reading history. We were captivated by Winston Churchill more than 30 years ago when we read together our first biographies of him, and indeed we're shameless history geeks. We served Paul Roget at our wedding in 1990 because of that. But now, in the face of recent assaults on the reputation of Churchill, and indeed upon the very nature of historical truth and the culture we cherish, we decided to see what could we do? What if anything, can we do in this fight? And this is a new kind of endeavor for us. We've not done something like this before. So in selecting a philanthropic organization to support, we focused on several attributes relevant to the ICS. And the first was, what is the mission? If you're going to do this, it shouldn't be a hobby. There should be a mission. And the mission of the International Churchill Society, to preserve the memory and relevance of Sir Winston Churchill, it's noble, it's worthy, it's vital. I think we've known that for years. But during these times, when the mission needs to be not only to preserve, but also to protect Churchill's legacy, the mission is critical. Second, can the organization make a real difference? There's no point in getting involved unless there is real work to be done, work that truly matters, real accomplishments to be had. And for the ICS, the answer is clearly yes. The lessons of Churchill's courage and perseverance in the face of dire and seemingly impossible challenges, those lessons are more essential than ever in our lifetimes here in this room and listening and watching. When the clouds of totalitarian threats abroad once again form on our horizons, and misguided ideologues at home seek to topple, deface, and erase our history. So we will need to light the signal fires and man the watchtowers for Churchill for years to come. Third, we focused on execution. Is the organization effective? Is it well run? Is it efficient? Does it get stuff done? In my career, I learned that's pretty darn important, and it'd be difficult to find an organization of this type which accomplishes so much so well. The ICS is really a shining star in that regard. And then finally, trust. Are the staff, the board, the members, is this a group? Are they dedicated? Are they honorable? Are they the right people for the job? Are you going to be proud to be associated with them? And the answer is unquestionably yes. And Jane and I kicked this around and said, let's see what we can do. So I reached out to the immensely talented Justin Reich, cold call. He didn't know who I was. I'd never met him. And we talked, and I came up with some thoughts. And Justin said, I think the organization might welcome your contribution and welcome you on board. And then he introduced us to the kinetic, irrepressible, irresistible force of nature named Lawrence Geller. He not only welcomed us on board, he hoisted us on board. I soon learned that Lawrence has abandoned Churchill's command of action this day. For Lawrence, it's always action this minute. Thank you very much. And Lawrence, you've transformed this organization, and we all owe a huge, huge debt to you. So, our first lecturer in this multi-year series is the incomparable Andrew Roberts. We're all familiar with his Walking with Destiny, acclaimed as the best single-volume life of Churchill ever written. And we all eagerly await reading his newest book, which is out, I think, just this week, a path-breaking biography of King George III. In true Roberts form, this book promises to draw upon new sources, marshal new analysis, and lead to a reappraisal of what Andrew calls the last king of America. These recent works are only the newest achievements of a remarkable career. Now, I could stop here right now and just pull out today's Daily Telegraph, which proclaims that Andrew Roberts is the greatest biographer writing in the English language today. But there's more. Professor Roberts earned a first-class honors degree in history and later a PhD at Cambridge, where he is an honorary senior scholar. He's a visiting professor at War Studies in King's College, a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He's a Lehman Institute lecturer at the New York Historical Society, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Historical Society, and the Napoleonic Institute. Trustee of the Margaret Thatcher Trust of the National War Museum. He's an expert television commentator. He's presented a 4-part series on the BBC. And too many honors and awards to even catalog here today. And of course, for the ICS, for this organization, he is and has been an indefatigable supporter, a member of the board, a member of the International Council, and generous with all of his talents and energy. For us, for Jane and for me who love history, it's his books that stand above all. And for many historians, if you spent your whole life and all you got done was Walking with Destiny, that would be a career, okay? That would be enough of a career. But Professor Roberts has written or edited 19 books of history. It's astounding. And if you haven't read his Life of Napoleon, one of the best biographies I've ever read, or The Storm of War, a truly path-breaking history of the Second World War, or Waterloo, or Napoleon in Wellington, or the history of the English-speaking people since 1900, you're in for a real treat. In his preface to The Storm of War, Andrew Roberts refers to a quote about his chosen craft. He says that writing history is like W.C. Fields juggling. It looks easy until you try and do it yourself. And just to give a tiny glimpse into those labors, it's worth reading the acknowledgments pages in Napoleon or The Storm of War or his other books. Most people just flip through those pages, right? But you will find page after page after page after page acknowledging the places he went, the people with whom he spoke, the sources he consulted. On Napoleon alone, 69 archives in 15 different countries. Amazing. Behind each entry, there's a story of relentless scholarship. Andrew Roberts not only prowls the archives, he actually gets out and he walks the battlefields. And you can tell when you read his books. He brings to the writing of history a dedication to fact and truth, the courage to take on the myths and distortions, the integrity to affirm the essence of our noble and courageous history, even with all of its imperfections. And he writes with a verve and indeed audacity that is rare in works of history, unless, of course, you read the volumes of history written by Winston Churchill. So we are privileged to hear this evening from Andrew Roberts, and I'm going to present to Professor Roberts from the Society this bust of Winston Churchill. And we are very proud and happy that you're here today.
Bring it in.
Thank you.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for those tremendously kind words. I had a lovely evening yesterday sitting close to Jane, and it's a delight to have met you both. At first glance, Winston Churchill's stance on Russia seems to fit in well with his detractors' charges of political inconsistency. He started off anti-Russian until 1914, then he became pro-Russian until 1917, when he became anti-Russian until 1938, when he became pro-Russian until 1939, when he went anti-Russian until 1940, when he became pro-Russian until 1946, when he became anti-Russian until 1949, when he started working for a settlement for Russia. No fewer than 6 changes of stance, which collectively have been held against Churchill as displaying precisely the kind of general opportunism that his enemies accuse him of, both during his lifetime and since his death. The POS lectures, this inaugural one of which I'm honoured to have been asked to deliver tonight, will cover 3 aspects. They'll be about the protection and extension of freedom, as Steve said, the way that study of the aspects of life and career of Winston Churchill can help that, and a defence of his memory from revisionist detractors who are motivated by ideology rather than evidence-based history. I believe that nothing achieves all 3 of those objectives better than an investigation into Churchill's lifelong relations with Russia. What I will argue tonight is that, in fact, Churchill's stance towards Russia was entirely consistent from start to finish. For the first 40 years of his life, Churchill's overall stance was anti-Russian, as one might have expected from a British imperialist at a time when the greatest threat to British India appeared to come from losing the great game being played on her northwest frontier against the Tsarist Empire. His earliest reference to Russia appears in his poem Influenza, written in 1891, where one stanza runs, "O'er miles of bleak Siberian plains, where Russian exiles toil in chains, it moved with noiseless dread. And as it slowly glided by, there followed it across the sky the spirits of the dead." So even as a 15-year-old schoolboy at Harrow, Churchill was cognizant of the Russian government's cruelty to its internal exiles. As a young Tory politician, he asked a meeting in Southsea in October 1898, "Where is the glory of the starving peasant arrayed in purple and in the cloth of gold? This is the imperialism of modern Russia." Later, as a Liberal, he stuck to his theme, telling an audience in Llandudno in October 1904 that we remember what Russian despotism means to all who care about liberty. We remember the struggles of Poland and the Finns. We remember the massacres of Kishinev. That was a Cossack pogrom in 1903 that killed 49 Jews. And the horrors of Blagovestchek, where 5,000 Chinese were massacred in cold blood in 1900, and of the Russian march to Peking. We know how great powers have trembled all these years at the menace of the Russian power, and how that stern authority seemed established forever on high upon unshakable foundations. 2 months later, at the Coal Exchange in his Manchester North West constituency, Churchill spoke of how we see in the system of the Russian government, I will pick my words with care, a total violation of all fundamental liberal principles which England and Europe and America have discovered and enjoyed. One wonders what he might have said if he had not been picking his words with care. He also spoke of gross corruption in all branches of Russian administration and denounced the weak vacillations of an unfortunate sovereign, Nicholas II, who with extraordinary foresight he likened to Louis XVI of France. Yet, and we shall see this again and again, for all Churchill's strictures against the successive Russian governments, he never displayed any antipathy towards the Russian people themselves. Indeed, quite the opposite. My whole heart, and that of every liberal-minded man in this country, he told his audience, goes out without stint or grudge towards those people of Russia, of every class, who are doing their best to achieve a victory for the liberties of the people. Then came the Great War, and Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, naturally ceased his criticisms of Britain's vital ally on the Eastern Front. He continued speaking of the great Russian people in glowing terms and made regular references to the immense resources of Russia, especially in her manpower. He even went so far as to claim in late 1914 that we may see a Poland united and in loyal and harmonious relations with the Crown of Russia, which frankly was largely wishful thinking. At a recruiting meeting in July 1915, Churchill spoke of how the Russian armies have devoted themselves with generous valor and energy and with a tireless self-sacrifice in the common cause beyond all praise and commendation to maintaining the war. And such has been the fury of the conflict on the Eastern Front that for the time being, the Russian armies, suffering from a shortage of munitions, are experiencing a temporary check on their vigor of their offensive operations. Sadly, it turned out to be much more than a temporary check. In January 1915, so hard-pressed were they by the Germans that the Russians asked the British government to arrange for, quote, a demonstration of some kind against Turkey. That, in the words of the editor of Churchill's collected speeches, Robert Rhodes-James, provided the occasion, rather than the cause, of the plan which had been maturing since the first month of the war. As the Director of Military Operations, General Caldwell, later told the Dardanelles Commission, Mr. Churchill was very keen on attacking the Dardanelles from an early stage. He was very keen to get it to Constantinople somehow. If Turkey could be knocked out of the war, it would have been of inestimable help, this is me speaking rather than General Caldwell, to Russia, which was fighting a war on 3 fronts against the Central Powers and the Ottoman Empire. In his resignation speech as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on the 15th of November 1915, Churchill told the House of Commons that in January, the Russian government had asked the Foreign Office whether some action against Turkey in the Mediterranean was not possible to relieve the pressure in the Caucasus. In consequence of those communications from the Foreign Office and the War Office, I began to direct the attention of the First Sea Lord and other naval advisers to the possibilities of action in Turkish waters. Russia was thus ultimately the start of the cause of the greatest single reversal of Churchill's life and career. The October Revolution of 1917 that brought the Bolsheviks to power also unleashed a torrent of rhetoric from Churchill that was not to be seen from him again until the Munich Agreement over 20 years later. Lenin was sent into Russia by the Germans, he told the House of Commons, in the same way that you might send a phial containing a culture of typhoid or of cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city, and it worked with amazing accuracy. The horrors of Marxism-Leninism made themselves apparent to him very early on, and Churchill followed them minutely with an appalled fascination, dedicating himself to warning about them and to strengthening the capacities of the West to defend itself against them. He was accused of stridency and obsession when he was denouncing Bolshevism, not least by his own Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Yet nonetheless, all his very worst predictions came to pass and more. And even his most extravagant language and seemingly outlandish predictions were more than fully justified over time, especially when it came to the inexorable bloodthirstiness of Stalin's purges. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Churchill's emotions about Russia closely mirror the Kubler-Ross grief cycle that people undergo when they or their loved ones are diagnosed with a terminal illness. The first emotion felt is denial, which was very much the case with Churchill during the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1920, during which he denied that the Bolsheviks would win the Russian Civil War and did everything in his very sadly limited power to prevent them from doing so. The aid which we can give to those Russian armies, which are now engaged in fighting against the foul baboonery of Bolshevism, can be given by arms, munitions, equipment, and by technical services, he told a lunch at the Mansion House in February 1919. If Russia is to be saved, as I pray she may be saved, she must be saved by Russians. It must be by Russian manhood and Russian courage and Russian virtue that the rescue and regeneration of this once mighty nation and famous branch of the European family can alone be achieved. Russia must be saved by Russian exertions, and it must be from the heart of the Russian people and with their strong arm that the conflict against Bolshevism in Russia must be mainly waged. Once it became clear in early 1920 that the Whites were probably going to lose the Russian Civil War, however much aid the West gave them, Churchill morphed from the denial to the anger phase of his response to Russian Bolshevism. Was there ever a more awful spectacle in the whole history of the world than is unfolded by the agony of Russia? Churchill asked in January 1920. It is reduced to famine of the most terrible kind, not because there is no food, there is plenty of food, but because the theories of Lenin and Trotsky have fatally, and it may be finally, ruptured the means of intercourse between man, between workman and peasant, between town and country. The theories of Lenin and Trotsky have driven man from the civilization of the 20th century into a condition of barbarism worse than the Stone Age, and left him the most awful and pitiable spectacle in human experience, devoured by vermin, racked by pestilence, and deprived of hope. British support for the White Russians ended in February 1920 when the cabinet decided against direct military intervention, except by gifts of arms. The next month, Churchill wrote to Lloyd George that since the armistice, my policy would have been peace with the German people, war on the Bolshevik tyranny. Willingly or unavoidably, you have followed something very near the reverse. Although he couldn't change cabinet policy, Churchill obtained special dispensation to say whatever he liked about the USSR. He certainly exercised it. As Chancellor of the Exchequer in July 1927, for example, he said that there is not one single social or economic principle or concept in the philosophy of the Russian Bolshevik which has not been realized, carried into action, and enshrined in immutable laws 1,000,000 years ago by the white ant. Yet, however evil the horrors of communism, such were the exigencies of realpolitik that by the late 1930s it became clear to Churchill that the USSR would be necessary to counteract the equally evil but much closer and more threatening danger posed by Nazi Germany. This was when he moved from the anger to the negotiation stage of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. And by 1938, he was advocating an alliance with the USSR that he had so eloquently denounced. Without eating any of his words of the previous 2 decades, he therefore started to argue that the Russians would need to form part of the cordon sanitaire that hopefully might encircle and tame the Third Reich, despite the fact that the USSR was nowhere contiguous with it, and despite the complications that therefore arose strategically from the Poles' understandable antagonism to the powers both to their east and their west. It was in a broadcast on the 1st of October 1939 that Churchill made his most famous remark about Russia. A few weeks earlier, V.I. Molotov and Joachim von Ribbentrop had signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, and Churchill told his listeners, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is the key. That key is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interest or the safety of Russia that Germany should plant itself upon the shores of the Black Sea, or that it should overrun the Balkan states and subjugate the Slavonic peoples of southeastern Europe. That would be contrary to the historic life interests of Russia." Less than 3 weeks later, the USSR invaded the eastern part of Poland, and the new frontier was drawn that Hitler was to violate 20 months later in Operation Barbarossa. And on the night of Barbarossa, on the 22nd of June 1941, Churchill stated in a broadcast that "no one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the last 25 years. I will unsay no word that I have spoken about it. But all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. The past, with its crimes, its follies, and its tragedies, flashes away." This is not the place to go through the long and complex story of Anglo-Russian relations during the Second World War. It's been done very well several times, including by David Reynolds, and most recently in an excellent book by David Owen, which is soon to be published, entitled Riddle, Mystery, and Enigma, which I highly recommend. The struggles over the date of the Second Front, Churchill's 2 visits to the Kremlin in August 1942 and October 1944, the moral conundrum he had to face when in 1943 the Nazis produced incontrovertible proof that it had been Stalin and not they who had shot 14,000 Polish officers in cold blood in the Katyn forest. All of these and more will be discussed by historians for as long as mankind is interested in great and terrible events. Some quotations of Churchill, all from 1942, illustrate well the mixed feelings he had about his Soviet allies, or perhaps more accurately, the difference between what he could say in public and in private. He spoke movingly and sincerely of the sacrifices of the Red Army and the Russian people throughout the war. But as before the revolution, he took care to differentiate between the Russian people and their government. "Everybody has always underrated the Russians," he told the Commons in April 1942 of the latter. "They keep their own secrets alike from foe and friends. Privately, however," he also said, "never forget the Bolsheviks are crocodiles. I cannot feel the slightest trust or confidence in them. Force and facts are their only realities." He also said in October 1942 that it would be a measureless disaster if Russian barbarism overlaid the culture and independence of the ancient states of Europe. Churchill was in full negotiation mode, both in its literal and in its Kubler-Ross sense, when he was discussing the percentages agreement of October 1944 and said in one of the toasts at a Kremlin dinner, "I've always believed, and I still believe, that it is the Red Army that has torn the guts out of the filthy Nazis." Similarly, at the time of Yalta, he told the House of Commons, "I feel that their word is their bond. I know of no government which stands to its obligations even in its own, more solidly than the Russian Soviet government. I decline absolutely to embark here on a discussion about Russian good faith." He was being too trusting. Stalin lied barefacedly to President Roosevelt and him at Yalta, especially over the future integrity and independence of Poland. Yet as he asked at Chequers on returning from Yalta in the immediate post-war world, what will lie between the white snows of Russia and the white cliffs of Dover? It was the realization that he had been deceived by Stalin at Yalta that brought on the fourth and penultimate stage of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, depression. Churchill was not a black dog depressive, but he did get depressed on those occasions when any sentient being would have, such as the fall of Singapore in February 1942 or the fall of Tobruk in June 1942. It was during this period of depression about the true nature of the USSR and the Cold War that would inevitably follow that Churchill ordered the Chiefs of Staff to draw up the plans for Operation Unthinkable, for a future war against Russia. The defeat in the 1945 general election coincided with it dawning on him that Stalin had no intention of honouring his promise of free elections in Eastern Europe. And by the 5th of March 1946, Churchill was ready to turn his depression into action when he gave the most consequential speech ever delivered by any leader of the opposition. Churchill's belief in liberty shines through in every line he delivered in the Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and also realism into the true nature of the Soviet Union, which set the West in good stead for the next 43 years of the Cold War. From what I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, he said, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than weakness, especially military weakness. He went on, I do not believe the Soviet Union desires war. What they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. In his famous meeting with the celestial version of his father at Chequers in 1947, Lord Randolph Churchill asks, is there still a Tsar? Yes, but he is not a Romanov. Winston Churchill replies, it's another family. He's much more powerful and much more despotic. It was Stalin's despotism that led Churchill to tell the House of Commons in January 1949, I think the day will come when it will be recognised without doubt, not only on one side of the House, but throughout the civilised world, that the strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race. That day certainly came, and must be the view of every objective historian, not least thanks to the work of scholars such as Robert Conquest, whose book, The Great Terror, published in 1968, unveiled the true extent of Stalin's crimes against humanity and the Russian nationalities. Having seen what he had of the Nazis in the 1930s, Churchill recognized that it was impossible to appease its sister ideology, communism. Together, they represented the twins of totalitarianism, and democracies could only find security through strength. I tell you, Churchill stated in March 1949, it's no use arguing with a communist. It's no good trying to convert a communist or persuade him. You can only deal with him on the following basis, by having superior force on your side in question. And they must also be convinced that you will use it. You will not hesitate to use these forces, if necessary, in the most ruthless manner, that you are not restrained by any moral consideration of the case arose from using that force with complete material ruthlessness. And that is the greatest chance of peace, the surest road to peace. As with so much that Churchill said, this is as true today than when facing totalitarianism, with regard to facing totalitarianism, as it was on the day that he said it 72 years ago. Only a month later, in April 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, and Churchill finally moved into the last phase of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, acceptance. Not acceptance of the moral right of the Soviet regime to exist, of course, he was never to accept that, but merely the acceptance that it could not now be overthrown by conventional methods from outside, which he feared continued to be the policy of the Eisenhower administration. He regretted the lack of moves by his old wartime colleague towards a grand nuclear settlement with the USSR, but rather the reliance on mutually assured destruction, which he saw as potentially dangerous and leading to an arms race. Although Churchill reached the moment of acceptance that Russia would remain in the grip of communism for the rest of his life, he told his private secretary, Jock Colville, that he would live to see victory in the Cold War. Sadly, Colville died in 1986, 3 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it showed Churchill's long-term optimism. He displayed a similar optimism in his speech to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on the 31st of March 1949, when he said of the oppressed millions behind the Iron Curtain that the machinery of propaganda may pack their minds with falsehood and deny them truth for many generations of time, but the soul of man, thus held in trance or frozen in a long night, can be awakened by a spark coming from God knows where, and in a moment the whole structure of lies and oppression is on trial for its life. From these and other statements, we can be certain that the shade of Winston Churchill was cheering when, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall was finally torn down and Soviet communism expired shortly afterwards. Similarly, we can be sure that he is in mourning the way that the freedoms won at that time were squandered, and that a perverted form of Tsarism has returned to Russia, one that is shorn of any of Nicholas II's reign's positive aspects in terms of a personally attractive and decent head of state. As we survey today the invasion of Crimea, the attempted destabilization of Ukraine and Estonia, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, the poisoning by Novichok of Dawn Sturgis, and the attempted murder of the Skripals, the persecution of Alexander Navalny, and so much else, it is clear that a vicious autocracy has returned to Russia. We should not deny, negotiate, or accept the new tyranny there. And although we may be depressed about it, the correct phase of the Kubler-Ross cycle for us to revert to is anger. Anger at the foul baboonery of Vladimir Putin and his henchmen. In considering Churchill's 6 changes of stance towards Russia during his life, it's instructive to return to that speech he gave during the Phony War, when he said that in attempting to unravel the riddle, mystery, and enigma of Soviet actions, that key is Russian national interest. For of course, it is Britain's national interest that provides the key to explain Churchill's seeming lack of consistency towards Russia. It was in Britain's national interest to oppose Russia when it posed a threat before 1914, support it when it became an ally against the Kaiser in the first part of the Great War, oppose it when it dropped out of the alliance and advanced the cause of world revolution in 1917, befriend it again when it seemed to provide a bulwark against Nazism, only to oppose it once it showed no such thing in 1939, and then ally with it once Hitler had invaded Russia in June 1941. Every change in Churchill's stance closely mirrored what was in British national interest, and that was to continue after Stalin showed his true nature after Yalta and tested a weapon that could destroy the world 3 years later. At each and every stage, ladies and gentlemen, while never resiling from his love of liberty and respect for the Russian people, Winston Churchill put the national interest first. Far from being inconsistent, as his detractors claim, with this key, we can see that he was utterly consistent in his attitude to Russia throughout his long life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for such a fascinating presentation on Churchill's oscillating views on Russia and bringing the complexity of Anglo-Russian relations up to the present day. We now have time for some questions. If you are in our audience, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you. And if you're watching online, then please send your questions using the function on our conference website, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So let's start with a question from the room, just here.
Hi, Andrew. I'm Neil Banerjee. We've corresponded over the email before. So we've talked about my dissertation on Churchill and Russia in the past. And so I'm taking a similar approach in my thesis. I'm talking about Churchill's realism in his attitude toward Soviet Russia and as to how there was a consistent sort of realism. You talk about the British national interest. I'm curious as to, do you think Churchill's conception or his desire to preserve the British Empire or his interest in upholding the European balance of power aligned with his interest in preserving the British national interest?
Thank you. Yes, I certainly do. Yes, of course. His horizons had to shrink with the power of Britain. So whereas back in the 1890s he would be wanting to preserve the British Empire, that's clearly not the case right at the end of his life, when he did recognise that it was under appalling strains and stresses, and it was anyway by that stage transmogrifying into a British Commonwealth. So he of course had to sort of cut his coat according to his cloth. But I think centrally, this line, this sort of golden thread through his stance on Russia was undoubtedly to try to get the best possible situation for Britain in peace and war. You know, it's so easy for detractors, and I'm sure some other questions will be about various detractors of Churchill. It's so easy for them to write about him now, 3/4 of a century later, parsing every phrase and quotation, of which, of course, with Churchill there are 6,000 pages of his speeches. But actually, when you come to consider how many of those changes of policy that I mentioned in that speech turned out to be the right ones, not just the right ones, but the right ones and early on as well. And even the ones that went wrong, such as the Dardanelles or the Russian intervention in the Civil War, actually showed that he had the right hope, the right sense of optimism, the right sort of moral courage, the stuff that matters in leadership, even when the things actually turn out to go wrong, which is a fascinating thing, because usually you assume that if something fails, it has nothing good behind it. But that's not true with his stance on Russia.
Thank you very much. We have another question. Back in the room, if you could wait for a microphone for a moment so our online audiences can hear.
Andrew, one of the little sidebars about Churchill and Russia is his relationship with Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, which is now been so well documented in the Maisky diaries. Can you talk a little bit about the two of them and their connections?
Yes, that's a very good question. We're incredibly fortunate that the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to the Court of St. James, 1932 to 43, were not intercepted at any stage by the NKVD, but were kept secretly by Maisky. And so we know from them, they've been published in extenso over 3 volumes in English translation, and this is literally sort of word for word. It's a great act of scholarship by Godorovsky on this, that he was in secret negotiation when out of office with Ivan Maisky in an attempt to create this cordon sanitaire, to draw the Russians into an anti-Nazi coalition. And they met at his flat in Westminster at Morpeth Terrace. They had to meet there because they feared that if they met in public, they would be followed and listened to by MI6. It's an extraordinary sort of thing. That is an aspect, actually. The MI5 rather than MI6. The MI5 spying on Winston Churchill in the 1930s is going to be, I think, the next great revelation. There is almost undoubtedly in the Secret Service documents, which of course are kept for 100 years. So I just hope I'm still alive when they come out. Some really interesting things. Not just the fact, of course, that he was being followed, despite having been a senior cabinet minister and under no threat of anyone thinking that he was a traitor. But actually what he said, it would be completely fascinating to be able to get the transcripts of any conversations that Winston Churchill was taped as having made with Ivan Maisky. Not least because we'd be able to check how accurate Ivan Maisky was in his diaries, because sometimes in his diaries he does insert his own language into what Winston Churchill was saying. I mean, there are moments where, according to Maisky, Churchill is speaking about, in positive terms, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I very much doubt is, in fact, is more Churchill than Maisky.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question.
Sorry, this is one from online. We've got many from online, unsurprisingly. The question is, Andrew, should Churchill have agreed to the percentages agreement with Stalin? Was this a bad strategic mistake?
I have always thought it was called the naughty document, the percentages agreement. It was the one you'll remember when meeting in Russia, Churchill and Stalin wrote on a piece of paper, and there's a big blue tick that Stalin put on it, and Alan keeps it very carefully and wonderfully in the archives, but he will let you see it if you ask nicely. And it's always been denounced, especially, I suppose, understandably in Eastern Europe, as having been an unacceptably vicious form of realpolitik, where you give 80% of one country, retain 20% of another, go 50-50 in Poland, and so on. Greece gets is 90-10 to the West. And this just does sound so much like the most terrible form of realpolitik. However, actually, if you look at the percentages that the West were going to get, this agreement saved democracy in Athens, the home of democracy, the place where democracy was created. It forced him, Stalin, to admit that there was going to be a 50-50 in Poland, which of course there wasn't, and he ripped that agreement up. The only places that we supposedly gave away were places that were already under the heel of the Red Army. So it seems to me that, yes, it seems quite cynical, but actually the deal he did, the percentages he got, were extremely good. And were I a Greek today, I'd be thrilled by this percentages agreement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those questions. And that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Andrew, for your excellent answers as well.